Hello and welcome to the International Society for Physical Activity and Health podcast. Today's podcast is one in a series of 9 podcasts on the 8 investments that work for physical activity. The 8 investments that work for physical activity are a call to action for everyone, everywhere, including professionals, academics, civil society and decision makers, to embed physical activity in national and subnational policies. It's time to get into our podcast for today with your host, Matthew Teppy McLaughlin. Okay, today I'm here with Professor Trevor Shilton. Trevor has been the lead of advocacy for a number of years for ISPAH. How are you doing, Trevor?
I'm doing very well, Teppy. And you?
Good stuff. So, we're here today to talk about the 8 investments that work for physical activity. And so why was it important for ISPAH to write these 8 investments that work for physical activity?
Well, it's a central principle of advocacy, Teppy, and vitally important that we build global consensus around what needs to be done to increase population levels of physical activity. And we do know what needs to be done. As an example of a hallmark of successful advocacy, pretty much every other area which has made rapid strides, the best example is tobacco, are all on the same page with a consensus agenda. And so, as I've said to folks before, if you ring the 10 leading experts in the world about tobacco control and ask them what needs to be done, they'll tell you the same things. That we need to increase taxes, we need plain packaging, we need hard-hitting education, etc. Now, we've taken giant strides in physical activity in that regard. We're still catching up, I have to say, but documents like the 8 investments and complementing excellent documents like the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity, more and more we would like to be in a position where everyone talked about us and says, when you speak to a physical activity person, you ask them what needs to be done, they all give you the same answer. They're all on the same page. So 8 investments is in part about that.
What are the 8 investments that work for physical activity?
Well, the 8 investments, as you'd expect from a complex behaviour, they cover a range of settings like schools, workplaces, and healthcare settings. They deal with transport systems and built environments, public education, which is important and overarching across those different endeavours, the field of sport and sport for all, and community-wide initiatives. They're the 8 investments, but of course they all hang together in a complex and important system because they're joined up. And a fundamental principle, and it's the same in tobacco control actually and physical activity, that when somebody asks you which one thing, if you could only do one thing, what works? It might be a little extreme to say, but one thing doesn't work. These things need to be done together. So, those things that I just listed across settings and across systems like transport and planning. And I think probably it's important to add that there's an equity dimension to this as well. So in being careful that while we are implementing these types of initiatives, that we're mindful of priority populations, the needs of girls and women, lower middle income country, contexts and disadvantage, and culture. So these things are all nuanced in Africa and South America and Europe. The evidence is the same, but the context is different.
Sure. So each of the 8 investments as part of this series of podcasts, we're going to have a podcast from each of the leads of those investments. So they'll be coming out over the coming weeks. So just probably going back a little bit really, in terms of the history of ISPAH's documents and what ISPAH has released. So I know that ISPAH released the 7 investments that work for physical activity. So how is the 8 investments that work different to the 7 investments?
I might touch on the first part of your question, because as a global society and an advocacy body for physical activity, we have tried to stay one step ahead of global movements like NCDs, like the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we wrote the Toronto Charter a long time ago because we were advocating to get physical activity considered in the World Health Organization and the United Nations considerations around NCDs. And no sooner had we written that, we knew we needed 7 investments, because the very next question was going to be, tell me what to buy.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, in 2016, we wrote the Bangkok Declaration. The Bangkok Declaration maps physical activity to the Sustainable Development Goals very nicely, and points out that it's not just about health, it's about poverty and disadvantage and climate change and environment and a whole range of other global concerns. So this year we've updated the 7 investments, 8 investments. Of course, the question on the tip of everyone's lips is what's the new one? And the new one is workplaces. Workplaces are vitally important. You'll hear about that in another interview, but the vast majority of adults spend a significant part of their day at work, and that environment impacts their health. We probably could have had that in the 7 investments, but it's in there this time. Mm. Importantly, it's actually how these 8 things hang together that makes the biggest difference.
Yeah, that was what I was going to get onto. I mean, it seems that the strengthening of the systems approach in this version compared to the 7 investments.
Yes, it is. And systems can sound complex. In fact, sometimes we're guilty of calling it complex. And I think we've got to stop doing that. You know, it's actually not complex. You know, when you want to get, and I'll use an example, when you want to get more children walking and cycling to school, then of course you need to be working with transport systems and networks around the school. You need safe urban planning and accessibility and road safety and personal safety considerations. You need public education targeted at children, but also targeted at parents, who are the principal permission giver when it comes to their child walking and cycling to school. So you can see just in that one example, and of course it goes without saying that schools and education are absolutely central to that objective. So in that one objective of getting more children walking and cycling to school, I can't remember how many I rattled off there, but at least 6 of the 8 investments come into play. And so that's how systems work. You know, if you want to optimally change that objective, you need to work cross-sectorally. You need to work with the different investments collectively. As I said, and the document says very clearly, there is no single solution to an objective like getting more kids walking to school or cycling to school.
Yeah. And with that example, I think it's a case that each of the investments, that combining them is greater than the sum of them. So having them all together and working together, the impact is better when they're working together than delivered in isolation.
Yes, ultimately, Tepi, what we want to see here is all of these investments embedded in policy. So we as an international society, ISPAH, strongly advocate for the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity. And countries and regions are looking for guidance in how to do that. And so we're not saying here's one investment, we're saying here's 8, and you should have all 8 embedded in policy and working together to achieve the common goal, which is to achieve our WHO or United Nations objectives of 15% decrease in inactivity by 2030.
Yeah, and perhaps that's why this is the right time to release the document, to kind of give some solutions to assist with the GAPA.
Yes, I mean, that's its fundamental goal. One is to build consensus, probably 2 things. One is to build consensus. As I said before, having the physical activity movement on the same song sheet. And secondly, to mobilize that consensus through advocacy. So we would call upon our members to do whatever they can to disseminate this through media, through social media, through conversations, through direct political advocacy, particularly in those countries that don't yet have a national physical activity strategy. And Australia, where I come from, is a great example of that. You know, we're a country that are very advanced in research and very advanced in our interventions, but we don't have a national strategy. Tools like the 8 best investments are a great complement to GAPA in giving guidance to countries about where to invest.
Yeah, so you were touching on a call to action for the people listening to this podcast to, share, disseminate, incorporate within their conversations with media, etc. So they can find stuff on our website in the advocacy kit.
Yeah. I mean, your point is, of course, absolutely centrally important. We don't write these documents for the purpose of having a publication. We write these documents because we hope they'll make a difference. And so we want people to share it. We want people to disseminate it. We want people to mobilize their networks around this. And ultimately, its success will be when we have robust national level policies that reflect these 8 investments.
Yeah, and at the end of the document, we've got 3 suggestions. One, to share, the second, to endorse, be that for an individual or an organization, and also the third one, to feedback and let ISPAH know how you've been using the document.
Yeah, you asked me about the website. We will have on the website to coincide with the launch. Of course, we'll have the document. We'll probably by then have some translations of the document as well. But we'll also have some advocacy tools, things like checklists, releases, sample letters that you can send to stakeholders, putting in your own context, advocacy for this document, and PowerPoint materials.
I know you've said previously, Trevor, that everyone can be an advocate. So I think for everybody listening, that's particularly important, that we can all help with this document.
Yeah, it's very important that everybody is an advocate. I mean, we're not always the one that fronts the television or is interviewed on the radio. We're not always the one that visits the minister and throws documents on the desk. But we all have a role to play, through our social networks, through our social media, through preparing data or preparing evidence. Every member of ISPAH, every member of the physical activity community should be an advocate.
It would be really great to get to that stage where smoking has got to, and so we do have a very clear and precise consensus on what to do.
And more broadly, Teppy, I don't want to make too much of the tobacco analogy, but what smoking tells us is that it can be done. In countries like my own, smoking prevalence is 1/3 of what it was in the 1980s. So we know we can do this, but it requires a concerted approach. And of course, ISPAH is doing what it can in that regard in terms of providing professional support to our members and others to advocate well.
So, of course, there's going to be 8 more podcasts after this one on each of the investments. Is there anything that you'd like to wrap up with today, Trevor?
No, I think it's important. We all work in our own areas, and some people are specialists in workplace health and others are specialists in transport. We all have our role to play. But if there's a key message here, it's one of the key messages here is that no one single solution works. And even if you're working in an area like workplaces, or at the example I used before was getting children to walk or cycle to school, it's actually in the joined up nature and the systems approach. One thing I didn't mention before is it really is beholden on governments to ensure that policies are backed up with sustainable financing, backed up with strong institutions, professional development and strengthening of the workforce. Those sorts of system requirements are important as well, along with research and monitoring and evaluation. So there are other examples of system supports that enable and enhance implementation.
Okay. Thank you for joining us today, Trevor.
My pleasure, Tevi.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. But if you haven't done so already, I'll encourage you to subscribe to your favourite podcast channel. The International Society for Physical Activity and Health podcast is available on all of the leading podcast channels, including Apple, Spotify, Google. If you've got an idea for a podcast, you can send that through to info@ispah.org. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you can join us on our podcast again soon.